Today I thought we'd take a look at the file and file system APIs. The two are closely related and we'll be jumping back and forth between them. So the file system API is used to reference a file on the user's system, and the file API is used once you've got the reference to that file to interact with the file. Maybe you're going to read it in or you're going to write some data to it. So to start with, I've got a file on the desktop called text file. There's nothing in here at the moment, so let's add some text. And this is just on my desktop. And if we open HISE again, so what we're going to do is we're going to get a reference to that file that's on my desktop. And the way we do that is we're going to use the file system API. And the file system API has some predefined locations that we can use as starting points. So let me bring the documentation onto the screen and we can have a look at this. So these are the predefined locations. So we've got filesystem.audio files, and that tells you where that's going. Filesystem.samples, that's going to there. Filesystem.appdata, so this goes to the plugins data directory on the user's system. Filesystem.userhome is the user's home folder, and filesystem.desktop, which is the one we're going to use, is the desktop, and filesystem.downloads is downloads. So we're going to go with the desktop one. So we're going to create a const, we're going to call it desktop, and that's going to be equal to filesystem, and we're going to call a function on the file system API, which is getFolder. And then for the location type, this is where we use one of those constants we saw. So we can type file system dot, and then we can scroll down, there it is, desktop. And if I hit F5, this variable desktop now contains a reference to the user's desktop folder. There are a few ways we can get the file on the desktop. We can search for files, we can present a file browser to the user. What we're going to do is we're going to use a function called getFile. So our variable that we've created here, desktop, creates a reference to the desktop directory on my computer. And we can test that by running the isDirectory command. So if we do console.print, right, desktop.isDirectory, and this isDirectory function is part of the file API. And if I hit F5 here, it says 1 because it is a directory. If I was to create a new variable and just give it a random string and try to run it on that variable, it gives an error because foo is not a file object, so it won't work. So this function only works when you use it when you've accessed things using the file or file system APIs. So we've got a reference to the desktop. Now we want to get a reference to the file on the desktop, our text file. So we'll create a new constant. We'll call it F for file, and that's going to be equal to desktop. And now we're going to call another function of the file API, which is getChildFile. And now we just pass in the file name that we want. So in this case, it's textfile.txt. And we pass that as a string. Is that lowercase? How do I spell it? Yeah, lowercase. Okay. And I've hit F5. That works fine, so we don't get any errors or anything. And now we have a reference to the file on the desktop. Let's just give a bit more room here. So we can see that in the script watch table, we can see our desktop variable, and it's of data type file. And then we can see our F variable is also of data type file. So even though desktop is a directory, the data type is file, which means you have access to the file API functions. Okay, great. So now we've got the file, we've got a reference to it. Now we can do various things with this file. So let me show you the documentation for the file API. So these are all the things we can do: create directory, delete files, getChildFile, that is the one we've already used. isDirectory, we looked at that as well. We can also use isFile to check if it's a file. loadAsObject, loadAsString. So this is the one we're going to use at the moment. So it loads the given file as text. So because our file contains some text, the text that we added to it, we can use this loadAsString function to get the text from the file and put it into a variable. So we'll create a new variable, text equals f.loadAsString, and we'll print that out to the console. I'll hit F5, and it says this is some text. So it is getting that text from the contents of this file. So if we add something else in here, it's like hello world, and then we hit F5 again, now it prints out hello world. So it's getting the contents of the file. Another thing we can do is we can write to the text file, and to do that we use a function called writeString. So this will replace any text that is already in the file. So if we decide what our text is going to be, so we'll say our text is going to be, this is some awesome text. And now we can do f.writeString and pass in our text. And now if I hit F5, we won't see anything happen, but if we go to that file on our desktop, it now says this is some awesome text. So we've written to this file. Now if we wanted to append text to the file rather than overwriting it, first of all we have to read the text in that's already there, add to it, and then write it back out. So our file currently contains the text, this is some awesome text. We're going to actually read it from the file instead, so we're going to do f.loadAsString. So we're reading that text file in, and then we're going to append to it. So we're going to say text plus equals, so that's to append. You could also do equals text plus, but it's faster to write plus equals. And I'll just put hello world on the end, just to be boring. And so now what we're going to see is the text that will be in the file is, this is some awesome text, and then it'll have hello world after it. So we'll hit F5, and it doesn't recognize plus equals. Alright then, it looks like we're doing equals text plus. Oh, silly mistake. We've got text as a const variable, so we couldn't change it after it's been declared, so we've got to do it like that. So we'll have it as a reg. There we go. And now if we go to that file, it's appended this text to the end of the line. Let's delete our hello world. We'll save the file. So now it just says this is some awesome text again. And back in HISE, let's say we want this text to appear on the next line. Well, we have to put a line break character. So that's going to be \r\n. It might just be \n. We'll find out in a minute. And I'll hit F5. And no, that was right. And it's moved it onto the next line. So in this way, using this these two functions, loadAsString and writeAsString, you can manipulate text files. You can either overwrite their contents or append to them, or just read them in and manipulate the text within HISE. It's also possible to write and read encrypted data, but I'm not going to cover that in this video. I'll be doing a special video for my Patreon supporters later in the month, so if you'd like to see that, head over to Patreon and check that out. Okay, now let's look at how you can prompt the user to select a file. So currently we're just getting the desktop and then we're saying getChildFile, but suppose we don't know where the file is and we want the user to be able to select it. So let's do that. So we'll have our console.print text again, just so we can have some output. And instead of relying on this desktop thing, we'll comment that out. And we'll comment this out. So that's the way we were doing it. So now we're going to do it slightly differently. So we're going to write Filesystem.browse. And we can give it the folder we want it to start searching in. And this would be something like Filesystem.desktop. Or any of those other constants that we looked at earlier. Do we want them to be able to overwrite the file? Are we asking for a save dialog? Not in this case, we're not, so we'll put in false there. We can put in a wildcard if we want to filter the types of files we're allowed to look for. So we're just going to be looking for text files, so that will be our wildcard. And now we have a callback. So this is going to happen asynchronously. So the user clicks a button, let's say, or a file browser opens, and other things can still be going on while that file browser is displayed. But as soon as a file is selected, it's going to trigger a callback function, which we're going to define here. And the function will pass, will get a parameter, and that parameter is the file the user selected. So we'll just put F there. And then we can remove this part inside our callback. So this part's just the same. F is our file. The only difference is the user selecting it from the file browser. And I'm going to hit F5 and it will pop up a file browser. And I can select the file on my desktop, hit OK, and it outputs the text. Now, of course, you don't have to have the file browser pop up when you hit compile in it. We can add a button to the UI to do that. So let's have a look at that. We'll just add a button. Call it btn browse. Change the text. We don't want it to save in preset, and we don't want it to be, we want it to be momentary, so I'll enable the momentary button. And then we'll create a callback for this button. And we only want this to be triggered when you click the button, not when you release. So we need to check that the button's value is set to 1. So we'll say if value. And then we're going to browse to the file. So we'll copy all of this and place it in here. And I'll hit compile. And now when I click the button, now it'll pop up the file browser. So if I click cancel, nothing will happen. This callback is only triggered if I actually select a file. And let's just have a look at another one of these constants. So we've got it currently set to filesystem.desktop. Let's change that to filesystem.downloads. And now it opens in my downloads folder, which is empty. And if I go back to my desktop, there's our file again. And again, it prints the text. Okay, let's tidy this up a bit. Get rid of that console.print. Get rid of this stuff. So we've just got our file browser here. And in fact, let's get rid of that line as well. Okay, so we've just got our file browser and we can select a file. Now let's look at deleting a file. So we've got our file object. Let's make this a bit smaller actually. There we go. So we've got our file object being passed in here. So on that object we can call, first of all we should check that it is a file. So we should say if f.isFile, just in case the user has selected something else. We want to make sure it is a file, so it's just a sort of safety check. It's good to get in the habit of doing that. And then we can say f.deleteFileOrDirectory. And this won't give a confirmation, so let me show you what happens here. So the file is still on the desktop there, we can see it. Click our button. Go to the desktop, select the file and hit OK, and it deletes the file from the desktop. Now we'll bring that file back. Now if we want to get confirmation from the user that they definitely want to delete the file, we can get that confirmation with a simple yes/no box. So we can write engine.showYesNoWindow. We give it a title, say delete. Give it a message. Are you sure? And then again we have a callback function which will get a response from the user, which will either be yes or no. And if it's yes, then it'll equal a 1. So we can say if response. And hit F5. So if the user says yes, then the file will be deleted. So let's have a look at that. So select the file. Are you sure? I'm going to click cancel, so that's the same as a 0. So the file won't be deleted. Do it again. Hit OK. and now we get an error. Okay, so let me show you why this happened. So this is an issue of scope. So f is being passed into this callback function for the file system, but it isn't being passed into the response callback from our yes/no window. So what we need to do is we need to store it in another variable here, for example. So we can say local, should we call it file? Yeah, it should be okay. File equals f. And then here we'll use file instead. And it's important that it's a lowercase f, so we're not interfering with the file API. So now that file should be visible inside our yes/no callback. There we go. And now the file's deleted. Okay, one last thing I'm going to show you is how to browse for a folder. So currently we're browsing for a file, but now we're going to browse for a folder. So we'll delete all of this. And now we're going to browse for a folder. So the way we do that is Filesystem dot browseForDirectory. And I'm not sure why the autocomplete didn't kick in there, but that's okay. And again, we give it a start folder. So again, I'll point it to my downloads folder, and then we give it a callback. So that's all that it requires. And the callback will have a reference to the directory this time. So it won't be a file, it'll be a directory. And this parameter, you can call anything you want. I'm calling it dir for directory, but if you want to call it f for file or something totally different, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so once the user clicks browse, it will open this browse for directory. And let me show you, we'll console.print dir, and we'll just see what that is. So I'll hit F5, we'll click browse. It's going to my downloads folder, so if I click OK, so it's telling us that dir is an object, and it's actually a file object, so we can perform all the things that you can do with files and directories. You can perform those functions on here as well. So if we wanted to delete my downloads directory, for example, we could write dir.deleteFileOrDirectory, and I clearly don't want to do that, so let's avoid that. And when you're writing your code, do make sure you put in confirmation messages when you're doing things like deleting files to make sure the user is absolutely certain of what they're doing. So if we want to see the path to the directory that the user selected, we can use the toString function. And again, I'll show you the documentation for this. So we just write toString, and then it wants a format, and these are our format options. So if we want the full path, or no extension, or just the extension or the file name, these are the constants that are part of the file object that we can use. So for example, let's say we want to print out the full path. We'll do dir.toString file.fullPath, and I'll hit F5. And now when we select a folder, it will print the full path to the console. Now those other options, which were no extension, only extension, or file name, they only apply if it's a file, but because we've got a directory here, all we can see is the full path. So two more things I want to show you is, one is how to create a new file, because we skipped over that, and how to create a directory. So we'll start off with how to create a directory. So we'll take our starting directory, which is selected by the user, but again, this could be one of the constants we looked at the beginning. So we'll do dir.createDirectory. And then we just give it the name we want, so we'll call it new folder. And if I open up my downloads folder here, so we can see it. So this is my downloads folder. I'll just make that a bit smaller. Make sure it stays on top there. So if I click browse, and I select my downloads folder in the file browser, it's going to create a new folder inside this folder. There we go. So quite handy just for creating new directories if you need to do that. Perhaps you're downloading some files to the user's computer and you want to store them in a particular folder. So now we'll look at creating a file. So let's create a file in my downloads folder. This time we won't use the browse thing. We'll skip over that. So let's just comment all of this out. So we'll get the downloads folder as we did for the desktop folder earlier. So downloads equals filesystem.getFolder filesystem.downloads. So we've got a reference to the downloads folder, and in here we're going to create a brand new file. So we know there's nothing in there at the moment, it's empty, but we're going to create a new file, and we're going to do that with the getChildFile function we used earlier. So downloads.getChildFile, call it newFile.txt. So getChildFile can be used to either get an existing file or to define a new one. I'll hit F5, and this is on init, so we'll see what happens. So I'll hit F5, we'll open the downloads folder, and there's nothing there. So this getChildFile won't actually create a new file until we write something to it. So this new file doesn't really exist yet, it just exists within HISE so that we can do stuff with it. And we should put it into a constant as well. So there we go, but still nothing in our downloads folder. But when we write to it, so we can go writeString, this is some text, and I'll hit F5 now, and now if we look in the downloads folder, there's our new file, and it contains the text. This is some text, and we're kind of back to where we started. The file system and file APIs are really quite easy to use, and the documentation is quite good. Sometimes you just need a little Kickstarter like this just to get you off the ground with it, but hopefully these things I've shown today will get you started with it, and you'll be able to carry on by yourself just following the documentation, because it's fairly self-explanatory after this. I will be posting that other video showing how to write and read encrypted files, so go on Patreon and look out for that. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them below the video. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.